In the humid summer of 1847, the cotton plantations surrounding Natchez, Mississippi, harbored whispered rumors about Sarah Whitmore, a woman who killed slaves for fun. Sarah Whitmore appeared as the picture of Southern gentility: porcelain skin, elaborate silk gowns, and a voice sweet as magnolia honey when greeting visitors on her sprawling plantation's wraparound porch. Behind her demure facade lurked something far more sinister. Sarah possessed an uncanny ability to sense fear in others, reading terror in a person's eyes like scripture. And this supernatural intuition guided her to those who would scream the loudest. The first signs of dread emerged when newly purchased slaves began disappearing from neighboring plantations, their bodies discovered weeks later in the bayou, bearing wounds that suggested prolonged, methodical torture rather than quick deaths. By autumn, 7 plantations would report mysterious slave deaths. 3 overseers would abandon their posts in the dead of night, and Sarah Whitmore would host the most elaborate dinner parties Natchez society had ever seen, all while something unspeakable festered in the root cellar beneath her grand manor. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. Perhaps we will uncover a story there. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile Mississippi Delta soil, its Greek Revival mansion perched majestically on the bluffs overlooking the muddy waters of the great river below. White columns rose 3 stories high, supporting expansive verandas that caught the morning breeze and provided shade during the sweltering afternoons of summer 1847. Cotton fields extended in neat rows as far as the eye could see, tended by nearly 200 enslaved souls who lived in the quarters beyond the main house. To any visitor arriving by riverboat or carriage, the estate appeared as the very embodiment of Southern prosperity and refinement. The mansion itself stood as a testament to wealth and taste. Hand-carved mahogany furniture filled rooms adorned with imported wallpaper from France, while crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across polished marble floors. Persian rugs softened footsteps in the grand foyer, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilt frames. Every detail spoke of money, power, and social standing within the tight-knit community of Natchez planters who competed fiercely for recognition and respect. In the kitchen that occupied the mansion's lower level, Mama Celia moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years perfecting her craft. Her weathered hands kneaded dough for the evening bread, while her sharp eyes missed nothing that occurred within the household. As head cook and unofficial leader among the house servants, she commanded respect from both the field hands and her fellow domestics. Her position afforded her certain privileges, including a small room adjacent to the kitchen and the responsibility of training younger servants in their duties. Tobias worked in the stables behind the main house, caring for the thoroughbred horses that were Colonel Whitmore's pride and joy. At 19, he possessed an intuitive understanding of horses that impressed even the white overseers who supervised the plantation's operations. His gentle manner with the animals had earned him a measure of trust from the plantation's management, allowing him greater freedom of movement around the property than most enslaved workers enjoyed. He often found himself running errands between the stables, the main house, and the fields, making him privy to conversations and observations that others might miss. Miriam served as personal maid to the lady of the house, a position that required discretion, skill, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate her mistress's needs. 22 years old, with intelligent eyes and careful movements, she had been selected for this role after demonstrating exceptional attention to detail in her previous work as a seamstress. Her duties included maintaining Sarah Whitmore's extensive wardrobe, arranging her hair, and attending to her personal correspondence. The intimacy of her position meant she spent more time in Sarah's presence than any other person on the plantation. Thomas Briggs had served as overseer of Whitmore Plantation for 3 years, having come to Mississippi from Virginia with excellent recommendations from his previous employers. A practical man in his 30s, he understood that successful plantation management required maintaining order among the enslaved population while maximizing cotton production. His approach favored efficiency over cruelty, though he never hesitated to use force when he deemed it necessary. He lived in a modest house between the main mansion and the slave quarters, positioning him to monitor activities throughout the property. The lady of the house remained something of an enigma to most who encountered her. Sarah Whitmore appeared at social functions when required, always impeccably dressed and perfectly mannered, but she showed little interest in the lengthy visits and elaborate entertainments that occupied most plantation wives. Her delicate constitution, as her husband explained to concerned neighbors, prevented her from engaging in the more strenuous aspects of plantation social life. She preferred the quiet of her private chambers and the solitude of her extensive gardens. Those who worked most closely with Sarah noticed peculiarities in her behavior that they discussed only in whispered conversations. Miriam observed that her mistress seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense the moods and fears of those around her, often commenting on a person's anxiety or worry before any outward signs providing apparent. Mama Celia remarked on Sarah's habit of staring intently at people during conversations, as if she were reading something invisible written across their faces. Tobias noted that the horses grew restless and agitated whenever Sarah walked through the stables, despite her gentle manner and soft voice. The surrounding plantations had begun experiencing an unusual number of deaths among their enslaved populations. Colonel James Hartwell, whose property bordered the Whitmore estate to the north, had lost 3 workers in the past month under circumstances that puzzled both him and his overseer. The victims had all been described as troublesome or difficult to manage, but their death seemed to follow no pattern of illness or accident that anyone could identify. Similar reports came from other neighboring properties, creating an undercurrent of concern among the planter community. Bodies, discovered weeks later in the cypress swamps and backwaters of the Mississippi, showed signs of trauma that local physicians found difficult to explain. The wounds appeared too precise and deliberate to result from animal attacks or drowning accidents, yet too elaborate to represent typical punishment or discipline gone too far. Dr. Morrison, who examined several of the corpses, privately expressed his bewilderment to Colonel Hartwell about the nature of the injuries, though he refrained from speculating publicly about their cause. The slave quarters buzzed with nervous energy as word of the deaths spread through the community. Older residents recalled similar unexplained disappearances from years past, while younger people struggled to make sense of the growing atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Some whispered of supernatural forces at work, while others blamed the increasing tensions between overseers and field hands. All agreed that something unnatural was occurring in their usually predictable world, though none dared voice their suspicions too loudly. Thomas Briggs found himself keeping closer watch over the Whitmore property as reports of the mysterious deaths reached his ears. His practical nature rejected supernatural explanations, but his experience told him that patterns of violence rarely emerged without cause. He began noting which enslaved workers seemed most anxious or fearful, and he paid closer attention to the nighttime activities around the plantation. His observations would soon reveal connections that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the peaceful estate he managed. The whispers began in the pre-dawn hours when Mama Celia rose to begin her daily preparations in the kitchen. As she moved through the familiar routines of stoking the fire and preparing breakfast, she noticed Miriam descending the servants' stairs with an expression of troubled confusion. The young woman's usual composure had cracked, revealing an underlying anxiety that she struggled to conceal from the other household staff. Miriam approached the older woman with hesitant steps, glancing around the empty kitchen to ensure their privacy. She explained in hushed tones that she had discovered something disturbing while tending to Sarah's wardrobe the previous evening. Hidden beneath layers of silk undergarments in the bottom drawer of an ornate chest, she had found several items that made no sense in the context of a lady's personal belongings. Strips of fabric stained with what appeared to be dried blood had been carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied with ribbon, as if they were precious keepsakes rather than discarded refuse. The discovery troubled Miriam deeply, because she could think of no innocent explanation for their presence. Sarah Whitmore showed no signs of injury or illness that would account for bloodied clothing, and the fabric appeared to come from coarse work garments rather than the fine materials that comprised her mistress's wardrobe. The careful preservation of these items suggested they held some significance beyond their apparent worthlessness, though Miriam could not imagine what purpose they might serve. Mama Celia listened to this account with growing unease, remembering her own unsettling observations about the lady of the house. She had noticed that Sarah often disappeared during the evening hours, claiming fatigue and retiring to her chambers, yet sounds of movement could be heard from other parts of the house well into the night. The older woman had attributed these nocturnal wanderings to restlessness or insomnia, but Miriam's discovery cast them in a more sinister light. The conversation was interrupted by Tobias entering through the kitchen's rear door, carrying fresh eggs from the henhouse. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress, and he immediately joined their whispered conference without being invited. He reported that the previous night had brought another series of strange occurrences that left him questioning his own senses. Around midnight, he had been awakened by sounds from the direction of the main house that seemed to originate from beneath the structure rather than within it. The root cellar attached to the mansion's foundation had always been kept locked, with Sarah Whitmore maintaining exclusive access through a key she wore on a chain around her neck. Tobias had never questioned this arrangement, assuming the space contained valuable provisions or wine that required protection from theft. However, the sounds he heard suggested human activity within the cellar, at an hour when all household members should have been asleep. Muffled voices and what might have been crying or moaning had drifted across the yard, though the thick stone walls made it impossible to distinguish specific words or identify the speakers. These revelations prompted Mama Celia to share her own troubling observations. She had noticed that Sarah's behavior followed distinct patterns that coincided with events occurring throughout the surrounding plantations. When word arrived of deaths or disappearances on neighboring properties, Sarah would experience a noticeable change in demeanor that lasted for several days. She became more animated in her speech, took greater care with her appearance, and displayed an energy that contrasted sharply with her usual claims of delicate health. The three servants found themselves drawn into a conspiracy of observation that felt both necessary and dangerous. They began paying closer attention to Sarah's movements and activities, noting details that had previously seemed insignificant or easily explained. Miriam reported that her mistress had requested unusual supplies from town, including lengths of rope, metal implements typically used for farm work, and lamp oil in quantities far exceeding normal household needs. When questioned about these purchases, Sarah had provided vague explanations about household repairs and improvements that never seemed to materialize. Meanwhile, the broader community continued to grapple with the increasing frequency of unexplained deaths among the enslaved population. Colonel Hartwell had taken to visiting neighboring plantations more frequently, ostensibly for social calls, but actually to gather information about the disturbing trend that seemed to be affecting every property in the area. His conversations with fellow planters revealed a pattern that defied logical explanation. The victims were invariably described as individuals who had displayed signs of fear or anxiety in the days preceding their disappearance. Overseers reported that these people had become increasingly agitated and difficult to manage, showing unusual reluctance to work alone or venture away from groups of other workers. Some had requested transfers to different duties or expressed fears about supernatural threats that their supervisors dismissed as superstitious nonsense. Margaret Hartwell had begun hosting informal gatherings for the wives of local plantation owners, using these social occasions to discuss their shared concerns about the mysterious deaths. The women found themselves comparing notes about changes in their households and communities, searching for connections that might explain the growing atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Several mentioned noticing increased restlessness among their own enslaved workers, who seemed to sense some threat that remained invisible to their owners. Dr. Morrison continued his examinations of the bodies recovered from various locations throughout the county, though his findings only deepened the mystery surrounding their deaths. The physical evidence suggested that the victims had experienced prolonged periods of extreme stress before their deaths, but the specific circumstances remained unclear. The wounds appeared to have been inflicted with careful deliberation rather than in moments of sudden violence, indicating a level of planning and intent that troubled the physician deeply. The enslaved community had developed its own network of communication that operated beneath the awareness of white authorities. Information traveled quickly between plantations through a system of coded messages and careful conversations that allowed people to share warnings and observations without directly challenging the established order. Stories began circulating about a malevolent presence that moved through the region, selecting victims according to some incomprehensible criteria that seemed to focus on those who displayed visible fear or vulnerability. Thomas Briggs found himself caught between his duty to maintain order on the Whitmore plantation and his growing suspicions about events occurring under his supervision. His practical experience told him that the patterns emerging throughout the area could not be explained by coincidence or natural causes, yet he lacked concrete evidence to support any specific theory about their origin. He began keeping detailed records of activities on the property, noting times, locations, and individuals involved in any unusual occurrences that came to his attention. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to take shape, though none of the observers yet possessed enough information to see the complete picture. The house servants continued their careful surveillance of Sarah Whitmore, while the broader community struggled to understand the source of the terror that had begun to dominate their daily lives. The truth remained hidden behind locked doors and whispered conversations, waiting for someone brave enough to confront the darkness that had taken root in their midst. Thomas Briggs spread his handwritten notes across the small wooden table in his quarters, studying the timeline he had meticulously constructed over the past several weeks. The pattern that emerged from his documentation painted a disturbing picture that challenged his rational understanding of plantation management. Each recorded death in the surrounding area corresponded precisely with periods of unusual activity at the Whitmore estate, creating connections that seemed too deliberate to represent mere coincidence. His records showed that Sarah Whitmore possessed an uncanny ability to identify potential troublemakers among the enslaved population before they exhibited any obvious signs of defiance or resistance. On 3 separate occasions, she had approached him with concerns about specific individuals who later disappeared from neighboring plantations. Her predictions proved accurate with a consistency that defied logical explanation, as if she possessed some supernatural insight into human behavior that allowed her to detect future problems before they manifested. The overseer recalled their most recent conversation, which had occurred just days before the discovery of another body in the cypress swamps north of the Hartwell property. Sarah had mentioned in passing that she found a particular field hand unsettling, describing him as someone who carried darkness in his eyes and would inevitably cause trouble for his owners. When pressed for specific examples of problematic behavior, she had provided only vague references to his demeanor and the way he looked at people. Yet her assessment had proven prophetic when the man vanished 2 nights later. Margaret Hartwell had been conducting her own investigation through carefully orchestrated social visits and tea gatherings with the wives of neighboring planters. Her observations revealed another disturbing pattern that connected Sarah Whitmore to the mysterious deaths plaguing their community. Every elaborate dinner party hosted at the Whitmore plantation had been scheduled within days of a reported disappearance, as if these social events served to celebrate or commemorate some private victory known only to their hostess. The timing of these gatherings struck Margaret as particularly suspicious, because Sarah had previously shown little enthusiasm for entertaining guests or participating in the social obligations expected of plantation wives. Her sudden interest in hosting elaborate dinners coincided exactly with the beginning of the unexplained deaths, suggesting a connection that Margaret found deeply troubling. She began keeping her own records, noting dates, guest lists, and menu selections that might provide clues to Sarah's true motivations. Dr. Morrison had completed his examination of the latest victim recovered from the backwaters near the Sinclair plantation, and his findings only deepened the mystery surrounding these deaths. The body showed signs of prolonged captivity and systematic torment that spoke to a level of cruelty that exceeded anything he had encountered in his medical practice. The wounds had been inflicted with surgical precision, suggesting knowledge of human anatomy that seemed inconsistent with random violence or spontaneous brutality. The physician noted that the victim had been kept alive for an extended period, while subjected to various forms of physical and psychological trauma. The pattern of injuries indicated that the perpetrator had deliberately avoided inflicting immediately fatal wounds, instead choosing to maximize suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness. This methodical approach to causing pain required both extensive knowledge and considerable time, suggesting that the killer operated from a secure location where screams would not attract unwanted attention. The enslaved community had developed its own theories about the source of the terror that had begun to dominate their lives. Mama Celia served as an unofficial conduit for information that traveled between plantations through a network of cooks, house servants, and field hands who maintained contact during market days and religious gatherings. The stories she collected painted a picture of supernatural malevolence that seemed to focus its attention on those who displayed visible signs of fear or vulnerability. Several witnesses reported experiencing shared nightmares that featured a woman in white who moved through their dreams with predatory intent, selecting victims according to some incomprehensible criteria that seemed related to their capacity for terror. These dreams occurred simultaneously across multiple plantations, suggesting a supernatural connection that transcended the physical boundaries between properties. The dreamers awakened with detailed memories of encounters that felt more real than ordinary sleep visions, leaving them convinced that some evil presence had invaded their minds during their most vulnerable moments. Tobias had begun timing his stable duties to coincide with Sarah's evening activities, hoping to gather more information about her mysterious nocturnal wanderings. His observations revealed that she followed a consistent routine that began shortly after the household retired for the night. She would emerge from the main house carrying a covered lantern and make her way to the locked root cellar, where she would remain for several hours before returning to her chambers. The sounds that emanated from the cellar during these visits suggested activities that had nothing to do with food storage or wine selection. The young man had managed to position himself where he could observe Sarah's return from these midnight excursions, and her appearance upon emerging from the cellar struck him as profoundly unsettling. She moved with a satisfied energy that contrasted sharply with her usual claims of delicate health, and her face bore an expression of contentment that seemed inappropriate for someone who had supposedly been tending to household supplies. Her clothing often showed signs of dirt or moisture that suggested more strenuous activity than a simple inspection of stored goods would require. Miriam had discovered additional evidence during her duties as personal maid that supported the growing suspicions about her mistress's true nature. Hidden among Sarah's personal effects, she found a collection of small objects that appeared to have been taken from various individuals. Hair ribbons, buttons, pieces of jewelry, and other personal items had been carefully preserved in a wooden box that Sarah kept locked in her private study. The diversity of these objects suggested they had been collected from multiple sources over an extended period, yet their significance remained unclear. The most disturbing discovery came when Miriam found Sarah's private journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her dressing room. The leather-bound volume contained detailed entries written in Sarah's precise handwriting that documented activities and observations that made no sense in the context of ordinary plantation life. References to experiments, subjects, and results suggested some ongoing project that required careful record-keeping, though the specific nature of these activities remained cryptic and disturbing. The pieces of evidence were beginning to form a coherent picture that pointed toward a conclusion too horrible for any of the observers to fully accept. Sarah Whitmore was not the delicate Southern belle she appeared to be, but rather something far more sinister that had taken root in their community like a malignant growth. The challenge now lay in determining how to confront this evil without becoming its next victims, a task that would require courage, planning, and perhaps divine intervention to accomplish successfully. The moonless night provided perfect cover for Tobias, as he crept through the shadows between the stable and the main house, his bare feet making no sound on the dew-dampened grass. He had been planning this surveillance for weeks, waiting for the ideal combination of weather and timing that would allow him to observe Sarah's nocturnal activities without detection. The absence of moon and stars created an impenetrable darkness that would conceal his presence, while still allowing him to witness whatever transpired near the root cellar. His patience was rewarded when the back door of the mansion opened with its familiar creak, revealing Sarah's silhouette against the faint glow of lamplight from within. She moved with practiced stealth, carrying her covered lantern and what appeared to be a bundle of rope over her shoulder. Behind her, a second figure stumbled forward with the awkward gait of someone whose hands had been bound behind their back. Tobias recognized the captive as Jacob, a field hand from the Henderson plantation who had gone missing 3 days earlier. The scene unfolded with terrifying clarity as Sarah led her prisoner toward the cellar entrance, speaking to him in soothing tones that contrasted sharply with the violence of his restraints. She unlocked the heavy wooden door with the key that hung perpetually around her neck, revealing a stone stairway that descended into absolute blackness. The lantern light flickered across rough-hewn walls as the pair disappeared underground, leaving Tobias alone with the horrifying realization that he had witnessed the beginning of something unspeakable. The sounds that emerged from beneath the earth over the following hours would haunt Tobias for the remainder of his life. Jacob's voice, initially raised in pleas and protests, gradually transformed into screams of terror and agony that seemed to emanate from the depths of hell itself. Sarah's voice could be heard intermittently, sometimes offering false comfort, and other times asking questions that elicited fresh waves of desperate crying. The systematic nature of the sounds suggested a methodical process designed to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness. Meanwhile, Mama Celia had made her own disturbing discovery while cleaning Sarah's private study during the lady's absence. Hidden behind a false panel in an ornate writing desk, she found a collection of personal items that told a story of systematic predation spanning several years. Hair ribbons belonged to young women from various plantations, lay neatly arranged alongside pocket watches, brass buttons, and small pieces of jewelry that had been carefully cleaned and polished until they gleamed like precious treasures. Each item bore a small paper tag inscribed with dates and brief notes written in Sarah's precise handwriting. The notations included physical descriptions, personality traits, and assessments of what Sarah referred to as fear capacity. Some tags contained disturbing observations about crying patterns, begging styles, and duration of consciousness that read like scientific data collected during laboratory experiments. The clinical nature of these records transformed personal belongings into specimens in some grotesque collection that celebrated human suffering. The most chilling discovery lay at the bottom of the collection, where Mama Celia found items that belonged to people she had known personally. A bone hair comb that had belonged to Ruth, a young cook who had disappeared from the Morrison plantation 2 years earlier, lay beside a silver thimble that Mama Celia recognized as belonging to Samuel, an elderly tailor whose body had been found in the river months after his disappearance. The presence of these familiar objects confirmed that Sarah's activities had been ongoing far longer than anyone had suspected. Colonel Hartwell had been conducting his own investigation through careful conversations with overseers and plantation owners throughout the region. His inquiries revealed that the mysterious deaths followed a geographic pattern that seemed to radiate outward from the Whitmore plantation, with the highest concentration of incidents occurring on properties within a 10-mile radius of Sarah's home. The correlation was too precise to represent coincidence, suggesting that the perpetrator operated from a central location and selected victims based on accessibility rather than random opportunity. Dr. Morrison had completed his examination of 4 additional bodies recovered from various locations throughout the county, and his findings painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic torture and murder. Each victim showed evidence of prolonged captivity and methodical abuse that spoke to a level of cruelty that exceeded anything in his previous experience. The wounds had been inflicted with surgical precision by someone who possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy and an apparent desire to maximize pain while avoiding immediate death. The physician noted that each victim had been subjected to similar treatment protocols that suggested the killer was refining techniques through repeated practice. Early victims showed signs of experimentation and trial and error approaches, while more recent cases displayed sophisticated methods that achieved maximum psychological impact with minimal risk of premature death. This progression indicated that the perpetrator was learning from each encounter and applying that knowledge to create increasingly effective forms of torment. Thomas Briggs had begun documenting a connection between Sarah's social calendar and the timing of local disappearances that painted a horrifying picture of calculated predation. Every dinner party, social visit, and community gathering, hosted by Sarah Whitmore, occurred within days of a reported missing person case, as if these events served to celebrate recent acquisitions or announce the completion of successful hunts. The precision of this timing suggested advanced planning and careful coordination that spoke to a level of premeditation that chilled him to his core. His records revealed that Sarah displayed a marked change in behavior following each disappearance, becoming more animated and socially engaged in ways that contrasted sharply with her usual claims of delicate health. She would spend hours planning elaborate menus, selecting expensive wines, and arranging flowers with an enthusiasm that seemed to draw energy from some external source. Her appearance would improve dramatically during these periods, as if the act of hosting these gatherings provided some form of spiritual nourishment that restored her vitality. Miriam had found Sarah's personal journal hidden in a secret compartment built into the floor of her dressing room, and the contents provided the final pieces of evidence needed to understand the full scope of her mistress's activities. The leather-bound volume contained detailed entries documenting 3 years of systematic abduction, torture, and murder that read like scientific research notes rather than the confessions of a disturbed mind. Each entry included clinical observations about victim responses, emotional reactions, and physical endurance that spoke to a methodical approach to causing human suffering. The journal entries revealed that Sarah viewed her activities as a form of spiritual evolution that was transforming her into something beyond ordinary human limitations. She described experiencing intense pleasure while absorbing the fear and pain of her victims, claiming that their terror provided her with supernatural energy that enhanced her beauty, intelligence, and social capabilities. The systematic nature of her documentation suggested that she was working towards some ultimate goal that required careful measurement and analysis of human responses to extreme psychological pressure. The convergence of evidence from multiple sources painted an unmistakable picture of Sarah Whitmore as a predator who had been operating in their midst for years without detection. The challenge now lay in determining how to confront this evil without becoming additional entries in her journal of horrors, a task that would require extraordinary courage and perhaps divine intervention to accomplish successfully. Mama Celia's hands trembled as she turned the pages of Sarah's journal, each entry revealing deeper layers of calculated evil that had been festering beneath the security health surface of their seemingly civilized community. The leather-bound volume contained 3 years of meticulous documentation that read like scientific research conducted by someone studying human responses to extreme psychological pressure. Sarah's precise handwriting filled page after page with clinical observations about her victims' reactions, emotional breakdowns, and physical endurance under various forms of torment. The journal entries were organized chronologically, beginning with tentative experiments that showed clear signs of inexperience and uncertainty. Early victims had apparently died too quickly for Sarah's purposes, prompting her to develop more sophisticated techniques that prolonged suffering while maintaining consciousness. She documented these improvements with the same methodical approach that a scholar might use to record botanical observations, noting which methods produced the most satisfying results in terms of fear generation and emotional devastation. Each entry included detailed victim profiles that Sarah had compiled through careful observation and social investigation. She recorded physical descriptions, personality traits, family connections, and what she termed fear capacity measurements that seemed to predict how each person would respond to psychological torture. The clinical nature of these assessments transformed living human beings into experimental subjects whose primary value lay in their potential to provide entertainment through their suffering. Margaret Hartwell had made her own disturbing discovery while examining the timing and guest lists for Sarah's elaborate dinner parties over the past several months. Every social gathering hosted at the Whitmore plantation had been scheduled to occur within 48 hours of a reported disappearance, creating a pattern that suggested these events served as celebrations rather than mere social obligations. The precision of this timing indicated advanced planning that required detailed knowledge of when victims would become available. The dinner party menus provided additional evidence of Sarah's true motivations, featuring elaborate dishes that seemed designed to commemorate specific achievements, rather than simply entertain guests. Exotic ingredients ordered from New Orleans, expensive wines selected for particular occasions, and elaborate table decorations that incorporated unusual symbolic elements all suggested that these gatherings held deeper significance than their surface appearance indicated. Margaret realized that she and other guests had unknowingly participated in celebration rituals that honored Sarah's successful hunting expeditions. Dr. Morrison had begun conducting more detailed examinations of the victims recovered from various locations throughout the county, and his findings revealed sophisticated torture techniques that spoke to extensive anatomical knowledge and careful study of human pain responses. The wounds had been inflicted with surgical precision by someone who understood exactly how much damage could be inflicted without causing immediate death. Each victim showed evidence of prolonged captivity and systematic abuse that had been carefully calibrated to maximize psychological impact. The physician noted that Sarah's methods had evolved considerably over time, with more recent victims showing signs of increasingly sophisticated torture protocols that demonstrated improved understanding of human endurance limits. Early cases displayed experimental approaches that sometimes resulted in premature death, while later victims survived much longer periods of abuse before succumbing to their injuries. This progression indicated that Sarah was learning from each encounter and applying that knowledge to refine her techniques. Sarah's journal contained detailed descriptions of her root cellar workspace, which she had converted into an elaborate torture chamber equipped with devices designed to restrain victims while providing easy access for various forms of physical and psychological abuse. She had installed additional lighting, ventilation systems, and soundproofing materials that allowed her to work without fear of detection while maintaining optimal conditions for extended sessions. The clinical precision of these preparations revealed someone who approached torture with the same methodical planning that others might apply to any complex project. The journal entries also documented Sarah's belief that consuming human fear provided her with supernatural abilities that enhanced her beauty, intelligence, and social capabilities. She described experiencing intense physical pleasure while absorbing the terror of her victims, claiming that their emotional energy was transforming her into something beyond ordinary human limitations. These passages revealed a delusional system that justified her actions as necessary steps in some form of spiritual evolution that would ultimately elevate her to a higher plane of existence. Thomas Briggs had discovered additional evidence while investigating the source of unusual supplies that had been delivered to the Whitmore plantation over the past several months. Sarah had ordered specialized equipment through intermediaries in New Orleans, including restraining devices, cutting instruments, and chemical preservatives that had no legitimate household applications. The careful concealment of these purchases suggested awareness that their true purpose would attract unwanted attention if discovered by local authorities. His investigation revealed that Sarah had been corresponding with medical suppliers and anatomical equipment dealers who specialized in serving university research departments and private physicians conducting experimental studies. The sophistication of her orders indicated extensive knowledge of human anatomy and torture techniques that seemed inconsistent with her background as a plantation wife. The source of this knowledge remained mysterious, though her journal suggested she had been studying medical texts and surgical manuals with the dedication of a serious scholar. Miriam had found additional documentation hidden throughout Sarah's private chambers that provided insight into the psychological motivations driving her criminal activities. Personal letters written but never sent revealed Sarah's contempt for the social restrictions placed on women of her class and her desire to exercise absolute power over other human beings. She viewed her torture sessions as opportunities to experience complete control and domination that were otherwise unavailable to someone in her social position. The hidden writings also revealed Sarah's belief that her activities were elevating her above the moral constraints that governed ordinary people. She saw herself as evolving beyond human limitations through her consumption of fear and suffering, claiming that each successful torture session brought her closer to achieving a supernatural state of existence. These delusions provided the psychological framework that allowed her to justify acts of extreme cruelty as necessary components of personal transformation. The convergence of evidence from multiple sources painted a complete picture of Sarah Whitmore as a sophisticated predator who had been operating in their community for years while maintaining a perfect facade of Southern gentility. Her systematic approach to abduction, torture, and murder revealed someone who combined extensive planning with deep psychological dysfunction to create a reign of terror that had claimed dozens of victims. The challenge now lay in determining how to stop her before she could add more names to her growing collection of trophies, a task that would require extraordinary courage and careful coordination to accomplish without becoming her next targets. The full scope of Sarah Whitmore's 3-year reign of terror became clear as the accumulated evidence painted a portrait of systematic predation that had claimed the lives of 27 people across 8 plantations. Her journal documented each victim with scientific precision, recording their names, ages, physical characteristics, and detailed assessments of their psychological profiles. She had developed a sophisticated understanding of human fear responses that allowed her to predict which individuals would provide the most satisfying experiences during her torture sessions. Sarah's method of victim selection revealed a calculated approach that prioritized psychological vulnerability over physical attributes. She sought out individuals who displayed visible signs of anxiety, depression, or trauma from previous experiences, believing that their existing emotional wounds made them more susceptible to the intense fear that provided her with supernatural nourishment. Her journal contained detailed character studies that read like psychological evaluations, documenting personality traits, behavioral patterns, and emotional triggers that she could exploit during her sessions. The root cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion had been transformed into an elaborate chamber designed specifically for psychological torture. Sarah had invested considerable time and money in creating an environment that maximized terror while providing her with complete control over every aspect of her victims' experiences. The space contained restraining devices, sensory deprivation equipment, and carefully positioned mirrors that forced captives to witness their own deterioration during prolonged captivity. Sarah's journal revealed that she viewed physical pain as merely one component of a more complex process designed to break down her victim's psychological defenses and create the intense terror that fed her supernatural abilities. She had developed techniques that combined isolation, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and carefully timed physical discomfort to create overwhelming fear responses that provided her with the emotional energy she craved. Her methods showed clear evidence of extensive study and experimentation that had been refined through years of practice. The supernatural aspect of Sarah's activities extended beyond simple sadism into genuine belief that she was undergoing a spiritual transformation that would elevate her beyond ordinary human limitations. Her journal entries described experiencing physical pleasure and mental clarity while absorbing her victim's fear, claiming that their terror was literally transforming her body and mind into something more powerful and beautiful than nature had originally intended. She documented changes in her appearance, energy levels, and intellectual capabilities that she attributed to this supernatural feeding process. Margaret Hartwell had documented Sarah's dramatic physical transformation over the 3 years since the mysterious deaths began occurring throughout their community. Photographs taken at social gatherings showed a progressive change in Sarah's appearance that seemed to reverse the normal aging process while enhancing her natural beauty beyond what should have been possible for a woman approaching 30 years of age. Her skin had become luminous and flawless. Her hair had grown thicker and more lustrous, and her eyes had acquired an intensity that made sustained eye contact deeply uncomfortable. These physical changes coincided with improvements in Sarah's social capabilities that allowed her to charm and manipulate people with unprecedented effectiveness. She had developed an uncanny ability to read people's emotions and motivations, using this insight to craft conversations that left guests feeling simultaneously flattered and unsettled. Her hosting abilities had become legendary throughout Natchez society, drawing invitations to every important social gathering despite her previous reputation for reclusiveness and delicate health. Dr. Morrison's continued examination of recovered bodies had revealed the true sophistication of Sarah's torture methods, which showed clear evidence of extensive anatomical knowledge and psychological manipulation techniques. Each victim had been subjected to carefully calibrated abuse designed to maximize psychological trauma while avoiding immediate physical collapse. The precision of the wounds and the systematic nature of the abuse patterns indicated someone who approached torture as both an art form and a scientific discipline. The physician's analysis revealed that Sarah's methods had evolved considerably over the 3-year period, with early victims showing signs of experimental approaches that sometimes resulted in premature death due to inexperience. More recent cases demonstrated mastery of techniques that could sustain conscious victims for extended periods while subjecting them to increasing levels of physical and psychological torment. This progression indicated that Sarah was treating each session as a learning opportunity that informed future improvements to her methods. Thomas Briggs had uncovered evidence that Sarah's activities were coordinated with elaborate dinner parties that served multiple purposes beyond simple social entertaining. The guest lists for these gatherings included influential plantation owners, local physicians, and government officials, whose presence provided Sarah with alibis while she celebrated her recent acquisitions. The timing of these events created perfect cover for her activities, while demonstrating her growing confidence in her ability to operate without detection. The overseer discovered that Sarah used these social gatherings to gather intelligence about potential victims from neighboring plantations. She would engage guests in seemingly innocent conversations about their workers, asking questions about disciplinary problems, escape attempts, and individuals who seemed particularly fearful or anxious. This information gathering allowed her to identify and target specific victims who met her psychological criteria while ensuring that their disappearances would not immediately raise suspicions. Miriam's access to Sarah's private chambers had revealed the existence of additional documentation that provided insight into her mistress's long-term goals and supernatural beliefs. Hidden correspondence with contacts in New Orleans and Charleston indicated that Sarah was part of a larger network of individuals who shared similar interests in what they referred to as fear cultivation and spiritual transformation through the consumption of human terror. These letters suggested that her activities were part of a broader movement that viewed torture and murder as legitimate paths to supernatural enlightenment. The correspondence also revealed that Sarah had been sharing her techniques and discoveries with other practitioners who were conducting similar experiments in different regions of the South. Detailed descriptions of torture methods, victim selection criteria, and supernatural feeding processes were being exchanged through coded letters that used agricultural terminology to disguise their true content. This network provided Sarah with both validation for her beliefs and access to improved techniques developed by others who shared her twisted philosophy. The journal's final entries documented Sarah's growing confidence in her supernatural abilities and her belief that she was approaching a crucial threshold in her transformation process. She wrote about sensing the presence of her victims' spirits, which she claimed were bound to her through the intensity of fear they had experienced during their final moments. These spiritual connections provided her with what she described as a constant source of energy and power that was making her increasingly beautiful, intelligent, and socially influential. Sarah's documentation revealed that she viewed her current activities as preparation for a final phase of transformation that would require a victim of unprecedented psychological sensitivity and terror capacity. She had been carefully observing the people around her, searching for someone whose fear would provide the intense spiritual nourishment needed to complete her evolution into what she believed would be a supernatural state of existence beyond ordinary human limitations. Sarah Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, watching Miriam tend to the rose garden below, her pale eyes studying the young woman's movements with the calculating intensity of a predator selecting prey. 3 years of systematic hunting had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated someone possessed the psychological depth and emotional sensitivity that would provide the most nourishing terror. Miriam displayed all the qualities Sarah sought in her final victim, the one whose fear would complete her supernatural transformation and elevate her beyond the limitations of ordinary human existence. The decision had been building in Sarah's mind for weeks as she observed Miriam's growing awareness of the truth behind the mysterious deaths plaguing their community. The young woman's intelligence and perceptive nature had allowed her to piece together evidence that others had missed, making her both valuable and dangerous to Sarah's continued operations. Her intimate knowledge of Sarah's daily routines and access to her private chambers meant that she possessed information that could expose the entire scope of her mistress's activities to outside authorities. More importantly, Miriam's awareness of her precarious situation had begun generating exactly the type of anticipatory terror that Sarah found most intoxicating. She could sense the young woman's growing fear during their daily interactions, watching as suspicion transformed into certainty, and certainty evolved into barely controlled panic. This psychological progression promised to create the intense spiritual energy that Sarah believed would be necessary to achieve her ultimate transformation into a supernatural being. Sarah began her preparation by altering Miriam's daily schedule in subtle ways that isolated her from the other house servants without creating obvious cause for alarm. She assigned additional duties that required Miriam to work alone in remote areas of the mansion, ostensibly to prepare for an upcoming visit from distinguished guests who would require the highest level of service and attention to detail. These assignments served the dual purpose of separating Miriam from potential allies while providing opportunities for Sarah to study her reactions under increasing psychological pressure. The elaborate psychological preparation phase allowed Sarah to indulge in her favorite aspect of the hunting process, which involved gradually revealing the truth to her intended victim while maintaining complete control over their response options. She began leaving subtle clues in places where only Miriam would discover them, including pages from her journal positioned where they would be found during routine cleaning duties. These revelations were carefully timed to build mounting terror, while ensuring that Miriam understood the futility of seeking help or attempting to escape. Sarah's supernatural abilities had grown considerably stronger over the 3 years of her killing spree, allowing her to sense Miriam's emotional state with unprecedented clarity and precision. She could detect the exact moment when suspicion transformed into certainty, when hope gave way to despair, and when courage crumbled under the weight of overwhelming fear. This psychological insight provided her with exquisite timing for each revelation, allowing her to maximize the impact of every piece of evidence that Miriam uncovered. The house servants, who remained unaware of Sarah's true nature, continued their daily routines, while unknowingly contributing to the psychological pressure being applied to their colleague. Mama Celia and Tobias had been strategically excluded from Miriam's recent discoveries, leaving her isolated with knowledge too terrible to share and too dangerous to ignore. Sarah orchestrated this isolation with careful manipulation of work assignments and social dynamics that prevented meaningful communication between the servants without creating obvious interference. As the psychological preparation intensified, Sarah began explaining her supernatural philosophy to Miriam during their private interactions, describing her belief that human fear represented a form of spiritual energy that could be harvested and consumed by those who possessed the necessary sensitivity and technique. She spoke about her transformation process with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a profound religious revelation, claiming that her activities were elevating her beyond the moral constraints that limited ordinary people. These philosophical discussions served multiple purposes in Sarah's overall strategy, allowing her to gauge Miriam's psychological responses, while gradually introducing concepts that would enhance her terror during the final phase of their relationship. Sarah described her previous victims in clinical terms that emphasized their role as spiritual fuel rather than human beings, explaining how their fear had contributed to her ongoing transformation into something more beautiful and powerful than nature had originally intended. Miriam's growing awareness of her situation created exactly the type of anticipatory terror that Sarah found most satisfying, providing her with continuous nourishment while she prepared for the elaborate finale that would complete her 3-year project. The young woman's intelligence made her fully conscious of her fate, while her position as a house servant prevented her from seeking help from authorities who would never believe accusations against a respected member of plantation society. Sarah began incorporating Miriam into her evening visits to the root cellar, ostensibly to assist with inventory management and organization tasks that required a trusted servant's attention to detail. These visits allowed Miriam to witness the true nature of the underground chamber, while providing Sarah with opportunities to explain the purpose and significance of the various devices and implements that filled the space. The psychological impact of these revelations provided Sarah with continuous spiritual nourishment while building toward the climactic experience she had been planning. The other house servants began noticing changes in Miriam's behavior that indicated severe psychological distress, though they attributed her anxiety to the general atmosphere of fear that had been affecting everyone in their community. Mama Celia observed that the young woman had become increasingly withdrawn and jumpy, startling at unexpected sounds and avoiding eye contact during conversations. Tobias noted that Miriam seemed reluctant to work alone and frequently glanced over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed or watched. Sarah's confidence had reached its peak as she prepared for the culmination of her 3-year journey towards supernatural transformation. Her journal entries from this period revealed absolute certainty that Miriam's terror would provide the final spiritual energy needed to complete her evolution beyond human limitations. She described feeling more beautiful, intelligent, and powerful than ever before, attributing these enhancements to the systematic consumption of human fear that had become the central focus of her existence. The final preparations included selecting the specific date and time for Miriam's capture, which Sarah planned to coincide with the new moon to ensure maximum darkness and minimal risk of outside interference. Her supernatural abilities had grown strong enough to predict exactly how Miriam would respond to each phase of the torture process, allowing her to plan an experience that would generate unprecedented levels of terror, while providing the spiritual nourishment necessary to achieve her ultimate transformation into something beyond ordinary human comprehension. The new moon cast no light across the Whitmore plantation as Sarah led her final victim down the stone steps into the root cellar that had become her temple of terror. Miriam's hands had been bound with silk rope that Sarah had selected specifically for this occasion, its softness providing a cruel contrast to the horrors that awaited in the chamber below. The young woman's eyes darted frantically around the underground space, taking in the specialized equipment and carefully arranged implements that revealed the true purpose of this hidden room. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency as she secured Miriam to the restraining apparatus she had perfected through years of experimentation with previous victims. The positioning allowed complete immobilization while maintaining optimal access for the psychological manipulation techniques that formed the foundation of her supernatural feeding process. She had learned that physical restraint was merely the beginning of effective terror cultivation, with the true artistry lying in the systematic breakdown of mental defenses that followed. The torchlit chamber revealed the extent of Sarah's dedication to her craft, with walls lined with implements designed for specific purposes in her elaborate torture protocols. Each device had been selected or modified based on lessons learned from previous sessions, creating a comprehensive toolkit that allowed her to orchestrate fear responses with the precision of a master musician conducting a symphony. The clinical organization of these tools reflected Sarah's scientific approach to what she considered her spiritual evolution. As Sarah began explaining her philosophy to the terrified young woman, her voice carried the fervent conviction of someone who had discovered profound religious truth. She described her 3-year journey of transformation with the enthusiasm of a scholar sharing groundbreaking research, detailing how each victim's terror had contributed to her ongoing evolution beyond the limitations of ordinary human existence. Her supernatural abilities had grown exponentially through this process, allowing her to sense and manipulate human emotions with unprecedented precision. Miriam's terror reached levels that exceeded even Sarah's heightened expectations, providing spiritual nourishment of extraordinary intensity that seemed to flow through her body like liquid fire. The young woman's intelligence made her fully aware of her situation, while her complete helplessness amplified her fear to degrees that Sarah had never experienced with previous victims. This combination created the perfect conditions for the final phase of Sarah's transformation, which she believed would elevate her to a supernatural state of existence. The psychological torture began with techniques that Sarah had refined through years of experimentation, designed to systematically strip away every psychological defense mechanism that might provide comfort or hope to her victim. She had learned that the most effective approach involved alternating between false kindness and sudden cruelty, creating an unpredictable emotional environment that prevented adaptation or psychological preparation for what might come next. As the session progressed, Sarah experienced the most intense supernatural feeding of her entire career, feeling power and energy coursing through her body as Miriam's terror reached unprecedented levels. Her reflection in the chamber's mirrors showed physical changes occurring in real time, with her skin becoming more luminous and her eyes acquiring an otherworldly brightness that seemed to emanate from within. She felt herself approaching the threshold of complete transformation that had been her goal throughout the 3 years of systematic killing. However, something unexpected began occurring as Sarah reached the peak of her supernatural high. Miriam, despite her terror and physical restraints, began speaking in a voice that seemed to carry power from sources beyond her individual strength. The words she spoke were not pleas for mercy or cries of despair, but rather an ancient curse that had been passed down through generations of her family, from a grandmother who had possessed knowledge of forces that predated European settlement of the Mississippi Delta. The curse that flowed from Miriam's lips carried the accumulated power of ancestors who had faced their own forms of systematic oppression and violence, channeling their spiritual strength through their descendant to confront the evil that threatened to consume her. The words themselves seemed to take physical form in the underground chamber, creating pressure and energy that Sarah initially mistook for the culmination of her transformation process. Sarah's supernatural empathy, which had previously allowed her to feed on the fear of others, suddenly reversed its polarity under the influence of Miriam's ancestral curse. Instead of absorbing terror from her victim, she began experiencing the accumulated fear and pain of every person she had tortured and killed over the past 3 years. The spiritual energy that had been flowing into her body suddenly reversed direction, forcing her to confront the full emotional impact of her actions from the perspective of those who had suffered under her methods. The reversal created an overwhelming flood of sensory input that Sarah's mind could not process or control. She experienced simultaneously the terror of every victim during their final moments, feeling their despair, agony, and hopelessness, as if these emotions were her own. The supernatural abilities that had made her feel powerful and transcendent now became instruments of torment that subjected her to psychological pressure far beyond anything she had inflicted on others. Physical manifestations of the curse began appearing throughout the root cellar as the spirits of Sarah's victims materialized in response to Miriam's invocation of ancestral power. These ghostly figures surrounded Sarah with expressions of righteous anger and supernatural authority that made her previous confidence crumble into abject terror. She found herself experiencing the same helplessness and despair that she had cultivated so carefully in others, realizing that her supernatural transformation was becoming a prison rather than liberation. The chamber that had served as Sarah's sanctuary of power was transforming into something far more sinister under the influence of forces beyond her understanding or control. The implements of torture that had provided her with such satisfaction now seemed to turn their attention toward her, creating an environment where she would experience every form of fear and suffering that she had inflicted on others. Her journal, which had documented her victims' responses with such clinical precision, would now serve as a blueprint for her own supernatural punishment. Miriam's curse had awakened something in the root cellar that would not be satisfied with Sarah's death alone, but would instead subject her to the same prolonged torment that she had visited upon so many others. The supernatural transformation that Sarah had sought through years of systematic killing would indeed occur, but not in the form she had anticipated or desired. The spirits of her victims had found their voice through Miriam's ancestral power, and they would not rest until justice had been achieved through Sarah's complete understanding of every moment of terror she had created. The curse unleashed by Miriam's ancestral power transformed Sarah's supernatural empathy into an instrument of relentless torment that subjected her to the accumulated terror of every person she had murdered over the past 3 years. What had once been her greatest source of pleasure and spiritual nourishment now became a conduit for experiencing the deepest fears and most profound suffering of 27 victims whose spirits had been bound to her through the intensity of their final moments. The reversal was immediate and absolute, stripping away her sense of power and control while forcing her to confront the true magnitude of her crimes. The root cellar, filled with the ghostly forms of her victims, their translucent figures materializing from the shadows to surround Sarah with expressions of righteous anger and supernatural authority. Each spirit carried the emotional imprint of their torture and death, radiating waves of accusation and demand for justice that penetrated Sarah's consciousness like physical blows. She found herself unable to look away from their faces, compelled by supernatural force to witness the pain and terror that her actions had created in each individual life she had destroyed. Sarah's carefully constructed delusions about spiritual transformation crumbled under the weight of this supernatural confrontation, revealing the true nature of her activities as nothing more than elaborate self-deception designed to justify acts of pure evil. The beautiful transcendence she had imagined was replaced by a horrifying reality where her victim's suffering had indeed changed her, but not in the ways she had anticipated or desired. Instead of elevation beyond human limitations, she had bound herself to the very people she had tortured, creating a spiritual prison from which there could be no escape. The physical manifestations of the curse began with subtle changes in Sarah's appearance that reversed the supernatural enhancements she had gained through years of feeding on human fear. Her luminous skin grew pale and drawn, developing the same hollow appearance that had characterized her victims during their final days. Her once lustrous hair became brittle and lifeless, while her eyes lost their otherworldly brightness and took on the desperate, haunted look of someone experiencing constant terror. As the supernatural punishment intensified, Sarah found herself reliving every torture session from the perspective of her victims, experiencing their fear, despair, and physical agony as if these sensations were her own. The empathic connection that had previously allowed her to feed on their terror now forced her to endure the full emotional impact of each death she had caused. The memories played continuously in her mind, creating an endless cycle of psychological torment that grew more intense with each repetition. The spirits of her victims began speaking to Sarah in voices that carried the weight of supernatural authority, demanding explanations for her actions, while refusing to accept any justification she attempted to provide. They forced her to acknowledge each life she had taken by name, describing in detail the families and communities that had been devastated by their deaths. The personal nature of these confrontations made it impossible for Sarah to maintain the clinical detachment that had allowed her to view her victims as experimental subjects rather than human beings. Sarah's attempts to flee the root cellar were thwarted by invisible barriers that the spirits had erected around the chamber, trapping her in the same confined space where she had conducted her torture sessions. Every door and window in the underground room became impassable obstacles that refused to yield to physical force or supernatural manipulation. The chamber that had served as her sanctuary of power was now her prison, designed to contain her until the full weight of her crimes had been experienced and understood. The psychological pressure created by constant exposure to her victims' suffering began breaking down Sarah's mental defenses in ways that mirrored the techniques she had used against others. Sleep became impossible as the spirits maintained their vigil around her, ensuring that she remained conscious and aware of every moment of torment they inflicted upon her consciousness. The sensory deprivation and emotional manipulation that had been her specialties were now being applied against her with supernatural precision and unlimited endurance. Physical deterioration accelerated as the curse consumed Sarah's body from within, reversing years of supernatural enhancement while adding new forms of suffering that exceeded anything she had inflicted on her victims. Her hands, which had once wielded torture implements with skilled precision, began shaking uncontrollably as if rejecting their previous actions. Her voice, which had spoken words of false comfort to dying captives, was reduced to hoarse whispers that could barely articulate her growing terror and despair. The supernatural feeding process that had sustained Sarah for 3 years was replaced by a spiritual draining that left her increasingly weak and disoriented as the curse drew energy from her body to fuel the manifestations of her victims' spirits. She could feel her life force being systematically extracted through the same empathic connection that had previously provided her with power and vitality. The irony of this reversal was not lost on her, as she realized that her supernatural abilities had become the mechanism of her own destruction. Sarah's journal, which had documented her victims' responses with such clinical precision, now served as a record of her own psychological breakdown, as the spirits forced her to experience every emotion and sensation she had recorded. The detailed observations she had made about fear responses, pain tolerance, and psychological breaking points became the blueprint for her own supernatural punishment. Each entry she had written with such pride and satisfaction now predicted another aspect of the torment she would endure. The root cellar's mirrors, which had been positioned to force victims to witness their own deterioration, now reflected Sarah's transformation into something that resembled her victims during their final moments. Her appearance showed the same hollow desperation, physical weakness, and psychological devastation that had characterized the people she had tortured. The supernatural beauty she had gained through years of feeding on fear was being systematically stripped away, revealing the spiritual ugliness that had always existed beneath her carefully maintained facade. As days passed in the underground chamber, Sarah's connection to the physical world began dissolving under the relentless pressure of supernatural justice. The spirits of her victims maintained their vigil with unwavering determination, ensuring that every moment of suffering they had experienced was returned to their killer with compound interest. The curse that Miriam had spoken was fulfilling its purpose by subjecting Sarah to the same prolonged psychological torture that had been her specialty, creating a perfect circle of supernatural justice that would continue until complete understanding had been achieved. The transformation that Sarah had sought through years of systematic murder was indeed occurring, but not in the form of transcendent beauty or supernatural power. Instead, she was becoming a reflection of every person she had killed, experiencing their collective terror and despair as her own permanent emotional state. Thomas Briggs discovered Sarah's body 3 days after her screams had finally ceased, echoing from the depths of the root cellar. The overseer had grown concerned when she failed to appear for her usual morning routine, and his investigation led him to the underground chamber, where he found her collapsed form, surrounded by the implements of torture that had once provided her with such satisfaction. Her face bore the same expression of absolute terror that had characterized her victims during their final moments, suggesting that she had experienced the same psychological breaking that she had inflicted upon so many others. The root cellar showed signs of supernatural activity that defied rational explanation, with scratch marks on the stone walls and strange burn patterns on the wooden surfaces that seemed to form meaningful symbols despite the absence of any obvious source of fire or heat. The restraining devices that Sarah had used to secure her victims appeared to have been turned against her, though no human agency could have accomplished such precise positioning of her body. The chamber felt charged with malevolent energy that made prolonged exposure deeply uncomfortable for anyone who entered. Miriam was found alive, but in a state of severe psychological shock that rendered her unable to communicate coherently about her experience in the underground chamber. Dr. Morrison examined her extensively, but could find no physical injuries that would account for her condition, though her mental state suggested exposure to trauma that exceeded anything in his medical experience. She remained conscious but unresponsive to direct questions, staring at empty spaces as if witnessing events that were invisible to others around her. The Whitmore plantation was abandoned within weeks of Sarah's death, as supernatural manifestations made continued habitation impossible for the surviving residents. House servants reported hearing Sarah's voice echoing through empty rooms at all hours of the day and night, speaking words of false comfort in the same tones she had used with her victims during their final moments. The sounds of movement in the root cellar continued despite the chamber being sealed and locked, suggesting that the evil that had taken root there would not be eliminated by Sarah's death. Colonel Hartwell assumed temporary management of the property while legal authorities attempted to settle questions about inheritance and disposition of the estate's assets. His workers refused to enter certain areas of the mansion after reporting encounters with ghostly figures that appeared without warning and vanished just as suddenly. The slave quarters were evacuated entirely when residents began experiencing shared nightmares that featured both Sarah and her victims, appearing together in scenes of supernatural confrontation that left everyone involved terrified and exhausted. The broader community struggled to comprehend the full scope of the horror that had been operating in their midst for 3 years without detection. Sarah's journal, which Thomas Briggs had discovered hidden in her study, provided documentation of 27 murders that had been attributed to accidents, illnesses, or runaways by authorities who never suspected the existence of a systematic killer among their social circle. The clinical precision of her records forced local officials to confront their complete failure to protect the most vulnerable members of their community. Dr. Morrison's examination of Sarah's remains revealed physical changes that seemed to contradict natural biological processes, suggesting that supernatural forces had indeed been active in her transformation and subsequent destruction. Her body showed signs of rapid aging that had compressed decades of natural deterioration into a matter of days, while her internal organs displayed damage patterns that resembled the effects of extreme psychological stress sustained over extended periods. The medical evidence supported witness accounts of supernatural intervention while challenging conventional understanding of human physiology. The curse that had claimed Sarah's life continued to manifest throughout the abandoned plantation, creating an environment where the boundary between the living and the dead had become permanently blurred. Visitors to the property reported encounters with ghostly figures that appeared to be both Sarah and her victims, locked in eternal confrontation that played out repeatedly in various locations around the estate. These manifestations suggested that the supernatural justice initiated by Miriam's ancestral power would continue indefinitely. Local authorities attempted to investigate the crimes documented in Sarah's journal, but their efforts were hampered by the supernatural activity that made detailed examination of evidence impossible. The root cellar became completely inaccessible when investigators reported being physically pushed out by invisible forces that seemed determined to protect the scene from outside interference. Attempts to remove Sarah's torture implements resulted in equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents that convinced officials to abandon their investigation. The enslaved community interpreted Sarah's death as confirmation that supernatural justice could prevail against even the most powerful earthly evil, though they understood that the victory had come at a terrible cost. Mama Celia and Tobias shared their knowledge of Sarah's activities with other plantations, ensuring that the truth about her crimes would not be forgotten or dismissed by authorities, preferred to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities about their society. Margaret Hartwell documented the supernatural phenomena that continued to plague the abandoned plantation, creating a record that would serve as a warning to future generations about the dangers of allowing such evil to take root in their communities. Her observations revealed that the curse had created a permanent supernatural prison where Sarah would experience eternal punishment, while her victims finally found the justice that had been denied to them in life. Decades later, the ruins of the Whitmore plantation remained a source of fear and superstition throughout the Natchez region. Local residents avoided the property entirely, sharing stories about supernatural encounters that suggested the curse remained active and would claim anyone foolish enough to venture too close to the cursed ground. Children were warned to stay away from the area, while adults crossed themselves and whispered protective prayers when forced to travel past the overgrown ruins. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's legacy lay not in the supernatural phenomena that marked her former home, but in the discovery that her journal had disappeared sometime after her death. Thomas Briggs had secured the volume immediately after finding Sarah's body, but it vanished from his locked office without any signs of forced entry or theft. The missing documentation suggested that someone else had acquired Sarah's methods and might be continuing her work in other locations. The terror that Sarah Whitmore had brought to the Mississippi Delta would live on in the memories and nightmares of those who had survived her reign of evil, while the supernatural forces she had awakened continued to guard against any attempt to repeat her crimes. The curse that had claimed her life served as both punishment and protection, ensuring that the evil she represented would never again find fertile ground in their community, while warning future generations about the terrible cost of allowing such darkness to flourish unchecked.